It was a cold, quiet night in Detroit. The streets were empty, except for the occasional car passing by. A young man, around 28 years old, was walking home after finishing his shift at a local garage where he worked as a mechanic. He had big dreams, not of fame or fortune, but of one day becoming a police officer. He'd always admired those who protected others and wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. As he turned onto his street, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. This was his neighborhood, the place he'd grown up in. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. He knew most of the people here, the elderly woman who always watered her plants late at night, the kids playing basketball on the cracked court down the block. He felt safe here, even though it was late. But fate had other plans for him that night. 2 blocks away, an armed robbery had just gone down. Someone had held up a convenience store, and the suspect was described as a tall black man wearing dark clothes. Police radios buzzed with updates, and officers were told to stay alert. They didn't have much to go on, just a vague description and the knowledge that the suspect might still be nearby. The young man didn't know any of this. All he knew was that out of nowhere, bright headlights blinded him. Tires screeched as multiple squad cars surrounded him. Before he could even process what was happening, doors slammed open and officers jumped out, shouting commands he couldn't quite hear over the chaos. "Get on the ground," someone yelled. He froze, confused. "What's going on? I didn't do anything," he shouted back, raising his hands instinctively. But his words fell on deaf ears. Within seconds, he was tackled to the pavement. The air rushed out of his lungs as heavy boots pressed into his back. Hands cuffed his wrists tightly behind him and punches rained down on his body. Each blow felt like fire, leaving bruises that would take weeks to heal. Through the pain, he kept screaming, "You've got the wrong person. I'm not who you're looking for." But no one listened. To them, he fit the description. A tall, black man in dark clothes. That was all they needed to justify their actions. When the beating finally stopped, he was dragged to his feet and shoved into the back of a police cruiser. His face throbbed, his vision blurred from tears and swelling. As the car sped away, he stared out the window at the familiar streets, now feeling alien and hostile. How could this happen? He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal simply because of how he looked. Hours later, he found himself sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room. Officers asked him questions about the robbery, none of which he could answer because he had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, miles away, another unit had already caught the real suspect. By the time the truth came to light, the damage was done. The officers who had beaten him offered no apology, no explanation. Instead, they released him without so much as a sorry. Walking home that morning, battered and humiliated, he made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't break him. If anything, it would make him stronger. He decided then and there that he wouldn't let this injustice define him. Instead, he would use it as fuel, to fight for change, to prove that justice could prevail, and to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had gone through that night. Little did he know, this moment would set him on a path he never imagined, one that would lead him straight into the heart of the system that had failed him. The days following that brutal night were a blur of pain, anger, and disbelief. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the marks left behind, not just on his skin but deep within him. The bruises would fade, but the memories wouldn't. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The screeching tires, the shouts, the punches. It wasn't just his body that had been attacked. It was his dignity, his sense of safety, and his faith in the very people who were supposed to protect him. At first, all he wanted to do was scream. Scream at the officers who had treated him like a criminal without cause. Scream at the system that allowed such things to happen. But screaming wouldn't fix anything. So instead, he channeled his frustration into action. He started by filing a formal complaint against the police department. It wasn't easy. There were forms to fill out, details to remember, and endless phone calls that went unanswered. But he refused to give up. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. He also hired a civil rights attorney, someone recommended by a friend who had gone through something similar years ago. Sitting across from the lawyer in a cramped office filled with stacks of files and legal books, he realized how daunting this fight would be. "You're going up against an entire system," the lawyer warned gently. "Are you ready for that?" He nodded without hesitation. "I have to be." But as the weeks turned into months, reality began to sink in. Filing complaints and pursuing lawsuits felt like shouting into the void. Sure, there were hearings and investigations, but nothing seemed to change. The officers involved denied wrongdoing, and higher-ups dismissed his case as a misunderstanding, even when evidence surfaced proving the real suspect had been caught. Shortly after the incident, no apologies came. No accountability. Just silence. One evening, sitting alone in his small apartment, he stared at the stack of papers on his kitchen table. Court documents, medical reports, witness statements. They told his story, but they didn't bring justice. He realized then that fighting back legally wasn't enough. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to go deeper. He needed to understand the system from the inside, to become part of it and challenge it from within. That's when the idea hit him. What if he became a police officer? At first, the thought made him laugh bitterly. How could someone who had been wronged so horribly by law enforcement ever join their ranks? But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Who better to push for change than someone who had experienced the flaws firsthand? Someone who knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of injustice? Still, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Becoming a cop required passing rigorous tests, both physical and mental. There were background checks, interviews, and training programs designed to weed out anyone who didn't fit the mold. And given his recent history, a wrongful arrest and a pending lawsuit, he knew he'd face skepticism every step of the way. Many would doubt whether someone like him could serve impartially or whether he harbored resentment toward the badge, but none of that mattered. He was determined to prove them wrong. He threw himself into preparation. Mornings were spent running laps around the park near his house, building endurance and strength. Afternoons were dedicated to studying law enforcement procedures, memorizing codes, and learning how to handle high-pressure situations. Nights were for practicing self-defense techniques in front of a cracked mirror, perfecting moves until his muscles ached. Along the way, he encountered unexpected allies. One day, while jogging, he struck up a conversation with an older man walking his dog. The man turned out to be a retired detective who believed strongly in reforming the force. Over coffee, the two talked for hours about the challenges facing modern policing. The retired detective shared stories of good cops trying to make a difference despite systemic issues. Inspired, the young man asked for advice, which the detective gladly offered. "You'll face resistance," the older man warned. "People won't trust you because of your past. But don't let that stop you. Show them you're there to help, not to hurt." Those words stuck with him. They reminded him why he was doing this. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but to create a world where no one else would have to endure what he had. Slowly but surely, his hard work paid off. He passed the written exams, aced the physical tests, and impressed interviewers with his passion for justice. Not everyone supported him. Some questioned his motives, others outright opposed him. But he didn't care. He kept pushing forward, driven by the belief that one person could make a difference. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, he read it over and over, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that he hadn't let that night break him. Instead, he had used it as fuel to rise above, to turn pain into purpose. As he stood outside his apartment building later that evening, holding the letter tightly in his hand, he looked up at the stars. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could help rewrite the rules. Hope that he could show the world what true justice looked like, not through anger or bitterness, but through action and determination. And with that, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. Joining the police academy was like stepping into a whole new world, one that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The young man had spent months preparing for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare him for what lay ahead. From day one, he realized that becoming a police officer wasn't just about learning how to wear a badge or carry a gun. It was about proving himself in a system where trust didn't come easily, and earning respect from people who weren't sure they could give it. The academy was tough, no doubt about it. Early mornings started with grueling physical training, running, laps around the track until his legs burned, doing push-ups until his arms trembled, and practicing defensive tactics until his knuckles were raw. Some recruits struggled to keep up, dropping out after weeks of exhaustion. But not him. Every bead of sweat, every strained muscle reminded him why he was there, to rewrite the narrative, to show that someone with his background could rise above everything stacked against them. It wasn't just the physical challenges that tested him. The classroom work was just as demanding. Hours were spent studying laws, procedures, and codes of conduct. He pored over textbooks late into the night, determined to understand every detail. There were quizzes on traffic stops, role-playing scenarios for de-escalation, and lessons on how to handle high-pressure situations without letting emotions take over. Each test felt like another hurdle, but each passing grade brought him closer to his goal. What made things harder was the skepticism he faced from some instructors and fellow recruits. They whispered behind his back, questioning whether someone with his past, a lawsuit against the department, an arrest record, even though it was wrongful, could really serve impartially. "How can we trust him?" one instructor asked during a private meeting with the commanding officer. "He's been on the other side of this." But instead of letting those doubts get to him, he used them as motivation. If anything, their lack of faith only fueled his determination to prove them wrong. During drills, he pushed himself harder than anyone else. In discussions, he spoke up when others stayed silent, sharing thoughtful insights born from personal experience. Slowly but surely, he began to earn respect, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through sheer grit and integrity. One person who surprised him was a veteran trainer named Officer Reynolds. At first glance, Reynolds seemed like the type who wouldn't give him the time of day, gruff, no-nonsense, and skeptical of anyone who hadn't paid their dues. But as the weeks went by, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the young man handled difficult scenarios with calmness and empathy, or maybe it was the quiet confidence he showed, even when others doubted him. Whatever it was, Reynolds started taking notice. After a particularly intense drill where recruits practiced breaking up a heated argument between two civilians, Reynolds pulled him aside. "You handled that well," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "Most rookies would have escalated it, you didn't." "Thank you, sir," the young man replied, trying to hide his surprise. Reynolds hesitated before adding, "Look, I know your story, and I won't lie. It gave me pause. But if you're half as committed to this job as you seem, then maybe you're exactly what we need around here." Those words meant more than Reynolds probably realized. For the first time, someone within the system acknowledged his potential, not despite his past, but because of it. It was validation that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. There were good people in the force too, people who believed in reform and saw value in fresh perspectives. As graduation day approached, nerves kicked in. Would he measure up? Had he done enough to prove himself? These questions swirled in his mind as he polished his boots and adjusted his uniform for the ceremony. When his name was called, and he stepped forward to receive his badge, a wave of emotion hit him. This wasn't just a piece of metal pinned to his chest, it was a symbol of resilience, hard work, and hope. Afterward, standing outside the academy building in full uniform for the first time, he felt a mix of pride and responsibility. Pride for how far he'd come, and responsibility for the road ahead. His journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Tomorrow, he'd report for duty in the very district where he'd been assaulted years ago. The thought sent chills down his spine, but not out of fear, out of resolve. He knew the streets, the struggles, and the people who lived there. More importantly, he understood what it meant to feel powerless, and he was determined never to let anyone else experience that kind of helplessness. As he walked home that evening, the weight of his badge heavy on his chest, he repeated a silent promise to himself. "I'm not here to repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm here to fix them. And with that, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into the next chapter of his life, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The first day on the job felt surreal. Wearing the uniform he'd worked so hard to earn, he stepped out of the precinct and into the streets of the same neighborhood where his life had been turned upside down years ago. The air smelled familiar, like car exhaust mixed with the faint scent of grilled food from a nearby corner shop, but everything else felt different. This time, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was part of the system now, and that came with a weight he couldn't ignore. His partner for the day was Officer Daniels, one of the men who had been involved in his wrongful arrest. It wasn't something either of them had planned. It was just how the roster fell. When they were assigned to patrol together, Daniels froze for a split second before forcing a stiff nod. "Morning," he muttered, avoiding eye contact as they climbed into the squad car. For a moment, the tension in the vehicle was thick enough to cut with a knife. The young officer gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady his breathing. He hadn't expected this, not on his very first day. Part of him wanted to confront Daniels right then and there, to let him know exactly how it felt to be beaten and humiliated by someone wearing that same badge. But he stopped himself. Now wasn't the time for anger or revenge. If he was going to make a difference, he needed to rise above all of that. Instead, he broke the silence with a simple question. "Where do we start?" Daniels glanced at him, clearly surprised by the calm tone. Patrol the usual route," he replied awkwardly. "Check in at the convenience store on 5th Street. They've been having trouble with shoplifting." As they drove through the streets, memories flooded back. The screeching tires, the shouts, the punches. But instead of letting those thoughts consume him, he focused on the present. Kids played basketball on cracked courts. Elderly women chatted on stoops, and shopkeepers swept their storefronts. These were the people he was here to serve, the ones who deserved better than what they'd gotten for so long. When they arrived, at the convenience store, the owner greeted them warmly. "Good morning, officers," he said with a smile. "Haven't seen you around before." "This is my first day," the young officer replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "I grew up in this neighborhood, figured I could help give back." The owner's eyes softened. "That's good to hear. We need more folks like you around here." Daniel stood off to the side, watching the exchange silently. For the first time, the young officer noticed a flicker of discomfort in his partner's expression. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. Whatever it was, he chose not to call attention to it. Instead, he focused on building rapport with the store owner, asking questions about recent incidents and offering advice on improving security. Later, as they continued their rounds, Daniels finally spoke up. "Look, I know who you are," he admitted quietly, staring straight ahead at the road. "And I know what happened that night. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have gone down the way it did." The apology caught him off guard. He hadn't expected it, not from Daniels, not ever. But instead of feeling vindicated or triumphant, he felt conflicted. Anger and forgiveness wrestled inside him, neither fully winning out. After a long pause, he simply nodded. "It's in the past," he said evenly. "But let's focus on doing our jobs right moving forward." Daniels looked relieved, but still uneasy. Yeah, okay." From that point on, their partnership began to shift. Daniel started opening up more during patrols, sharing stories about his own struggles with balancing duty and morality. Turns out he wasn't the cold, heartless figure the young officer had imagined him to be. Beneath the uniform was a man, wrestling with doubts about the system he served, a man who wanted to do better but didn't always know how. Over the next few weeks, the young officer threw himself into his work. He walked the beat with purpose, introducing himself to residents and business owners. He listened to their concerns about crime, about mistrust of the police, about feeling forgotten by the city, and promised to do what he could to help. Slowly but surely, he started earning their trust. People began stopping him on the street to chat, thanking him for being approachable and respect. Months had passed since his first day on the job, and the young officer was starting to feel like he was making a difference. The nickname Officer Integrity stuck with him, whispered among residents and even muttered occasionally by fellow officers. It wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility. Every call he responded to, every interaction he had, reminded him of why he'd chosen this path. He wasn't there to enforce rules blindly. He was there to rebuild trust one step at a time. One chilly evening, while patrolling near the apartment building where he'd once been wrongfully arrested, dispatch came over the radio. Possible. Disturbance at 42nd and Main. Reports of shouting and possible weapons involved. His stomach tightened as he recognized the address. It was just 2 blocks from the exact spot where his life had changed forever. He exchanged a glance with Officer Daniels, who was still his partner on most shifts. Over time, their relationship had shifted. What started as awkward tension had evolved into a cautious respect. Daniels no longer avoided eye contact or hesitated to speak up during tense situations. In fact, he often deferred to the younger officer's judgment, especially when dealing with the community. "Ready?" Daniels asked, gripping the steering wheel as they sped toward the scene. "As ready as I'll ever be," the young officer replied, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside him. When they arrived, the street was eerily quiet. A few neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, watching nervously as the squad car pulled up. There, in front of an old brick building, stood 2 men yelling at each other. One clutched what looked like a baseball bat, while the other held a wrench. Their voices echoed through the empty street, sharp and angry. "Stay here," the young officer instructed Daniels before stepping out of the car. He approached slowly, hands visible, his tone calm but firm. "Hey, what's going on here?" Both men turned to face him, their expressions shifting from rage to confusion. The one with the bat pointed at the other. "This guy tried to break into my car." "No way," the second man shot back. "I saw him messing with my mailbox first." The young officer raised a hand, signaling for them to lower their makeshift weapons. All right. Let's take a breath, okay? Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." Daniel stepped out of the car too, standing a few feet back, ready to intervene if things escalated. But the young officer kept his focus on the 2 men, speaking softly but confidently. "Tell me what happened. From the beginning. One at a time." After some coaxing, the story unfolded. It was a misunderstanding, plain and simple. The man with the bat thought someone had tampered with his car stereo, so he confronted the neighbor he suspected. Meanwhile, the neighbor assumed the bat-wielding man was vandalizing his mailbox. Neither had intended to cause real harm. They were just scared and defensive. Once the truth came out, both men sheepishly lowered their weapons. The young officer helped them exchange apologies, then gave them a stern warning about keeping tempers in check. By the time he walked back to the squad car, the tension in the air had lifted. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows nodded approvingly as he passed. "That could have gone sideways fast," Daniel said, as they climbed back into the car. "Good call handling it like that." The young officer shrugged, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "If we're gonna fix things around here, we can't keep escalating every little thing. People are already scared enough." Word spread quickly about how he handled the situation. Residents began seeing him not just as a cop, but as someone who genuinely cared about resolving conflicts fairly. Shopkeepers invited him in for coffee. Kids waved at him from basketball courts. Even longtime skeptics of the police force started warming up to him. He became a familiar face, a symbol of hope in a community that desperately needed it. But not everyone appreciated his approach. Some veteran officers resented his methods, accusing him of being too soft or playing favorites. They rolled their eyes when he suggested alternatives to arrests like mediation or community service. During roll calls, snide comments floated around the room, remarks about how he didn't understand how things really worked because he hadn't been on the force long enough. At first, the criticism stung. He knew he was doing the right thing, but hearing constant negativity wore him down. Still, he refused to let it derail him. Instead, he leaned on the support of those who believed in him, like Daniels, who had become an unexpected ally. and a few other officers who quietly admired his dedication to reform. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating shift, he found himself sitting alone in the precinct break room. The weight of everything, the doubts, the resistance, the pressure, felt heavier than usual. Just as he was about to pour himself another cup of coffee, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You don't give up, do you?" He turned to see Reynolds, the gruff trainer from the academy, leaning against the doorway. Despite his tough exterior, Reynolds had always shown a surprising amount of respect for the young officer's determination. "I don't have the luxury of giving up," he replied honestly. "Too much is riding on this." Reynolds nodded, pulling up a chair across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Reynolds leaned forward, his expression serious. "Listen, kid. Change doesn't happen overnight. You're planting seeds. Right now, seeds that might not bloom for years. But trust me, people notice. And when they see someone sticking to their principles, even when it's hard, that's when real change starts." Those words stayed with him long after Reynolds left the room. They reminded him that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Yes, there would be setbacks. Yes, there would be days when it felt like nothing was working. But every small victory mattered. Every handshake, every thank you, every moment of de-escalation instead of confrontation. By the end of the year, the impact of his efforts became undeniable. Crime rates in the district dropped slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to catch the attention of higher-ups. Community meetings drew larger crowds, with residents voicing concerns directly to officers instead of avoiding them altogether. Even some of the skeptics within the department started coming around, admitting that maybe there was value in approaching things differently. One evening, as he walked home from his shift, he stopped at the corner where it had all begun. The place where he'd been tackled and beaten without cause. Standing there in uniform, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at what had happened, pride at how far he'd come, and hope for what lay ahead. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time he truly believed that change was possible. And as long as he kept showing up, kept pushing forward, he knew he could help make it happen. As months turned into years, the young officer's reputation grew, not just in his neighborhood but across the entire department. His methods weren't flashy or dramatic. They were rooted in listening, patience, and understanding. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who happened to be wearing the uniform, tasked with bridging gaps that had been left wide open for far too long. But not everyone was ready to embrace change. Some officers clung tightly to old ways of thinking, convinced that reform meant weakness. To them, every de-escalation tactic he used was proof that he wasn't tough enough. Every time he suggested alternatives to arrests, like community, service, or mediation, they muttered under their breath about how things were better when cops didn't have to tiptoe around public opinion. At first, he tried to ignore the criticism. He reminded himself why he'd joined the force, to make a difference, not to win popularity contests. But ignoring it only worked for so long. The resistance became harder to brush aside when whispers turned into outright hostility. Anonymous notes started appearing in his locker. "You're ruining the job," one read. Another simply said, "Go back where you came from." The words stung, but what hurt even more was realizing that some of these messages came from people he thought he could trust. Fellow officers who had once nodded along during roll calls now avoided making eye contact. Others openly mocked him in front of rookies, warning them not to follow his example if they wanted to survive in the force. It felt like being boxed into a corner, fighting battles on all sides. One night, after responding to yet another call, a domestic dispute that ended peacefully thanks to careful negotiation, he returned to the precinct to find a group of officers huddled near the coffee machine. They fell silent as he walked by, their eyes following him until he disappeared into the break room. When he glanced back, he caught fragments of their conversation. "Thinks he's better than us. Always. Playing nice." It would have been easy to let frustration take over, to lash out, defend himself, or demand respect. But instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of something Reynolds had told him early on. Change doesn't happen overnight. If he wanted to inspire real progress, he couldn't stoop to their level. He had to rise above it. That didn't mean he fought alone, though. Over time, he found allies in UNIO. The national conference was a turning point, not just for him but for the movement he had unintentionally become a part of. Standing on stage under bright lights, with hundreds of eyes fixed on him, he felt the weight of responsibility like never before. This wasn't just about sharing his story anymore. It was about planting seeds of hope in people who were desperate for change. As he spoke, he didn't sugarcoat anything. He talked openly about the night he was wrongfully beaten by officers, the fear, the humiliation, the anger that had burned inside him for months afterward. He described how that experience could have broken him, how easy it would have been to let bitterness consume him. But instead he chose a different path, one of action, resilience, and purpose. "I didn't join the force because I wanted revenge," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "I joined because I wanted to fix what was broken. Because if I could show even one person that justice doesn't have to look like punishment, if I could prove that trust can be rebuilt, then maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference." His speech struck a chord. People nodded along, some wiping away tears, others scribbling notes furiously. When he finished, the room erupted into applause so loud it made his chest vibrate. For a moment he stood frozen, overwhelmed by the response. Then, as he stepped off the stage, strangers began approaching him, lawmakers eager to collaborate, activists seeking advice, young officers inspired to follow in his footsteps. It was humbling, but also daunting. The attention brought opportunities, but it also magnified the challenges he faced back home. Not everyone welcomed his growing influence. Some veteran officers resented the spotlight he'd received, accusing him of grandstanding or trying to play savior. Anonymous threats escalated. Notes left in his locker turned into menacing phone calls late at night. Once, someone slashed the tires of his personal car while it was parked outside his apartment building. But the hardest blow came when higher-ups within the department started pushing back against his initiatives. Community outreach programs he had championed were suddenly defunded. Requests for additional training sessions on de-escalation techniques were denied without explanation. Even Daniels, his steadfast ally, warned him to tread carefully. "They're scared of you," Daniels said one evening after a particularly frustrating day at the precinct. "Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. You're showing people that things can be done differently, and that scares them more than anything." The young officer knew Daniels was right. Change always came with resistance, especially when it threatened the status quo. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to deal with. There were days when the negativity felt suffocating, when the constant pushback made him question whether all his efforts were worth it. On those days, he leaned on the community, the very people he had fought so hard to serve. They reminded him why he kept going. One afternoon, after responding to a minor traffic accident near a local school, a group of kids ran up to him, excitedly asking if he remembered their names from a recent basketball clinic he'd helped organize. Their laughter lifted his spirits in ways he couldn't explain. Later that week, an elderly woman stopped him on the street to thank him for helping her grandson find a job through one of his outreach programs. These moments kept him grounded. They reminded him that progress wasn't measured in headlines or awards. It was measured in smiles, handshakes, and quiet victories. Every time someone trusted him enough to share their struggles, every time a tense situation ended peacefully, he knew he was doing something right. Still, the resistance within the department continued to grow. A few officers began openly mocking his methods during roll calls, calling him Mr. Perfect, and rolling their eyes whenever he suggested alternatives to arrests. Others spread rumors about him, questioning his motives and loyalty. It was exhausting, but he refused to let it derail him. Instead, he focused on building alliances. He reached out to reform-minded officers across the country, forming networks to share strategies and support each other. Together, they drafted proposals for policy changes, stricter accountability measures, mandatory de-escalation training, and increased transparency in disciplinary actions. Though not all of their ideas were implemented immediately, the fact that they were being discussed at all was a victory. He also leaned heavily on Daniels, whose unwavering support became a lifeline during tough times. Though Daniels still struggled with aspects of reform, he admired the younger officer's determination and often acted as a buffer between him and the skeptics. "You've got this," Daniels would say whenever doubt crept in. "Just keep your head down and focus on what matters." What mattered most to him was proving that policing could evolve, that it didn't have to be defined by aggression or mistrust. So he kept showing up, day after day, putting in the work even when it felt thankless. He responded to calls with empathy, listened to residents' concerns, and pushed for solutions that benefited everyone. Slowly but surely, his persistence paid off. One evening, after months of advocating for reform, he received an email from the chief of police. Attached was a draft of new department-wide policies aimed at increasing accountability and improving community relations. Many of the ideas mirrored the proposals he and his network had submitted. Reading through the document, he felt a surge of pride, not just for himself but for everyone who had contributed to the effort. "This is huge," Daniel said when he showed him the email. "You did this, you actually pulled it off." He shook his head, smiling despite himself. "We did this. All of us. Of course, implementing the new policies wouldn't be easy. There would still be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel optimistic. Change was happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. That night, as he walked home from the precinct, he passed the corner where it had all begun. The place where he'd been tackled and beaten without cause. Stopping for a moment, he looked around at the neighborhood he now served. Kids played on the sidewalk, shopkeepers chatted outside their stores, and neighbors waved hello as they passed by. For years, this street had symbolized pain and injustice. Now it represented something else entirely: hope. Hope that even the most entrenched systems could be reformed. Hope that trust could be rebuilt brick by brick. And hope that one person, just one person, could spark a ripple effect strong enough to change the world. Taking a deep breath, he smiled softly and kept walking. The road ahead was still long, but he was ready. After all, he'd come too far to turn back now. Years passed, and the changes he had fought so hard for began to take root, not just in his district, but across the city. The new policies weren't perfect, and there were still moments when old habits crept back in. But something undeniable had shifted. Trust between the community and the police force was growing, slowly but surely. People who once avoided officers now greeted them by name. Shopkeepers who used to lock their doors at the sight of a squad car now invited officers inside for coffee. The young officer, now more seasoned and wise, became a symbol of what reform could look like. His story spread far beyond Detroit. News outlets wrote articles about him. Talk shows invited him as a guest, and advocacy groups hailed him as an example of how one person's courage could inspire change. Yet despite all the attention, he never lost sight of why he'd started this journey in the first place: to make life better for the people around him. One evening, after a long day of meetings with city officials about expanding outreach programs, he found himself sitting on a park bench near where he grew up. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the basketball court where kids played noisily. A group of teenagers noticed him and waved. "Yo, Officer Integrity," one of them called out, grinning. "You coming to our game next week?" He chuckled, shaking his head slightly. The nickname still made him smile. It was a reminder of how far he'd come. "I'll try," he replied, raising a hand in acknowledgement. "But don't count on me being your MVP." The teens laughed, teasing him good-naturedly before turning back to their game. Watching them, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These were the moments that mattered, the small, everyday interactions that proved the world could be different, if people cared enough to try. As the years went by, his role evolved. He transitioned from patrolling the streets to training new recruits, passing on the lessons he'd learned along the way. In classrooms filled with eager faces, he taught Not just tactics and procedures, but values, empathy, patience, humility. He told his story openly, encouraging rookies to see themselves not as enforcers of rules, but as servants of the community. "You're going to face resistance," he'd say during lectures, pacing slowly in front of the class. "People will question your methods. Some might even call you naive. But here's the thing. Real change doesn't happen because it's easy. It happens because someone decides it's worth fighting for." His words resonated,